Good afternoon, everybody. It's Maynard and the rest of the cast of Close of Business Tuesday, and we're excited to tell you that today is Power Day at TPH, and you can't have Power Day unless you have a power superstar, and we've got Robert Bryce with us today. Welcome, Robert. It's fantastic to have you. Well, for those of you who don't know Robert, he is an author, he's a filmmaker, he's an acclaimed speaker, and an expert in the field of energy, in the field of power, really in the field of everything we've been talking about so many times here on our show, which is the intellectual honesty that's missing in the energy debate. Robert's at the center of trying to make it better. So welcome, Robert. We're going to kick around a few things just to level set, get us going here on Power Day. Mike Bradley, tell us what's happening in the markets. I know there were a couple of things on your mind. One, Saudi Aramco had earnings this week, and two, these credit markets, which have been very friendly to energy companies lately.
Yeah, it was interesting. Aramco had their Q2 update earlier this week, and they really hit on 4 or 5 different items, which I thought were interesting. First of all, as it relates to global demand, they're talking about global demand being around 90 million barrels, which is what we've been talking about for some time now. And they estimate by year, and they think, global demand's going to be back up to mid-90s. That's a bit of a stretch, but that's kind of where consensus is right now. As it relates to their production comments, they're talking about taking their maximum sustainable capacity from 12 million barrels a day to 15 million barrels a day. As we know, they've already gotten to 12, in April. But the issue is getting to that 15 million barrels a day. They were going to be spending a lot of money next year to get there in the next couple of years. There's just no way they're going to get there anytime soon because they're going to be bringing their CapEx down quite significantly in 2021. They have not given what the estimates are going to be for CapEx next year, but they prior CapEx was 40 to 45 billion. My guess is it's going to be probably in the mid 30s, versus sort of mid 20s where it is this year. And the last thing I think was interesting to me is that, or two things. One is they really are focusing on petrochemicals. They think that's the area of growth for them. Production is really not. They want to get more downstream. That's why they bought SABIC. That's why they're looking at Reliance. And they really are looking at, just the global refining chemical and natural gas. The last thing I found really interesting is they spent a lot of time on this call talking about hydrogen and renewables, crude to hydrogen technology, which was a new one for me. I had not heard that before. They're thinking about it. And so they're probably going to be in it. It's kind of funny. I remember 2 years ago, there was a Tesla call when everyone was thinking that, the sovereign wealth fund was going to be buying into Tesla, and now they're looking at hydrogen. So it just shows that all these major oil companies are looking to get further downstream, looking to get into this new technology, so you cannot discount it when the biggest company in the world is looking at it.
I think the other thing in there was a real commitment to keeping that dividend in the near to medium term. It's just part of their commitment to shareholders.
And that's the funny thing. That's why CapEx is going to be coming down. They went from like a 5% gearing to a 15 to 20% gearing this year because they massively outspend to pay the dividend. If you look at the dividend, it's around $17, $18 billion. They're going to pay that. So that's $70, $75 billion on top of what they're spending in CapEx. They're basically, just like some of these majors, gearing up in order to get there. So the good thing about it is they're consciously going to pay a dividend, which means CapEx is going to be dialed back. And what that means is that CapEx worldwide in 2021 is coming lower. Production's probably not going to grow. And so 21 is probably setting up to be a pretty interesting year for crude oil prices.
And I think the other reason the gearing went up, right, is this purchase of SABIC, which that was a lot of money. And also, Mike, you mentioned Reliance. You might clarify what you meant by that for our viewers.
Well, I mean, they're looking at, maybe investing in Reliance in the downstream in India. They've been kind of looking at this company for quite a while, and they're talking about it. Nothing really has come to fruition, but my guess is they're going to look to do something on that front probably in the next 6 to 12 months.
And let's hit the credit markets.
Yeah, the credit market's really interesting here. In the last week or so, maybe let's just say 2 weeks, we've seen names like IG-rated names like Concho and Pioneer have issued debt less than 2.5%. And to kind of put it in perspective, some of these companies, 3, 4, 5 months ago, not those particular companies in general, debt, they were floating debt at 4.5% and 5%. And so what you're seeing here, and you're also seeing the same thing with BP, Chevron, these guys are issuing debt as well. They're taking an opportunity because the debt markets are open, and their debt's being priced, percent and a half below where it was 3-4 months ago. And I think the other thing that's really important is non-IG credits. We all know who they are. They're not going to be able to issue a debt at these levels. And I think it's going to give a big strategic advantage to these IG-rated companies for two reasons. One, they're pushing their debt out to 27, 28, 29, 30. They're not going to really have any debt coming due over the next 3 or 4 years. And so that gives them a lot of flexibility to really go ahead and return free cash flow to shareholders. They've now talked about doing that in variable dividends. But I also think what's going to happen here is that it's going to set these guys up where they're not going to have any really debt maturities for 3, 4, 5 years. And it's going to allow them to really kind of step into the M&A market if they want to, especially with guys that have over-levered balance sheets with with debt expiring over the 22, 23, 24 time frame, because they'll be able to go ahead and refi that at pretty low rates. So you're going to get cost cuts. You're going to get SG&A cuts, interest cuts. And so, and generally these companies are trading much cheaper on a valuation basis. So I think that might lead, at some point to some M&A, maybe not today, but, next 6-9 months.
So big companies getting, we always think of big companies as having lower cost of capital, but it's been on display lately, and it could affect.
Yeah, definitely in the last week. And like I said, the debt markets seem very open right now. High yield is doing well. They're able to get this stuff off. And so, yeah, I think you're going to see bigger large cap names over the next couple of weeks are going to hit the market, especially, we've been talking about crude oil markets looking a little bit tepid at these points, simply because time spreads are getting weaker. And we're seeing that across the world. Good time to basically tap the markets, push out your debt into the late 20s and get some flexibility.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Matt, you had a couple comments on capital allocation, and want to tee up what Jordan's got for us this week?
Yeah, sure, Maynard. Last week, I think, was one of the more constructive conference call seasons we've had in a while. This has been a topic that's kind of been percolating around the industry for about 6 months. And we saw a number of companies take a leadership role in redefining and providing guideposts around capital allocation. And really what they're doing is they're setting up a situation where shareholders can think about these businesses as structurally generating free cash flow through the cycle. And they're effectively doing that by guaranteeing that they're going to spend somewhere between 70 and 80% of their cash flow, regardless of the commodity price, in order to generate that free cash. And that really is going to benefit the industry for a couple of different reasons. One, it's going to limit growth in an upswing. Two, it's going to allow companies, to Mike's point, with better balance sheets to start returning cash via variable dividends and common dividend growth, as well as share buybacks. And then three, I think it's just going to allow people to get more comfortable with the macro environment. And that's been the biggest problem for the industry over the last 4 or 5 years, is every time we saw an improvement in crude price, producers hit the drill bit, increased CapEx, swamped the market, and sent prices lower. And so I think this has been a big constructive positive takeaway. We saw a lot of incomings from clients on this topic last week, and we hope to see more of it from the industry as a whole. If the industry adopts this, as well as providing a cap on growth, there is a good shot over the next 1 to 2 years that you see some real structural investment coming back into the space in the upstream sector in particular. And so with that being the case, I want to bridge into something that is becoming near and dear to the TPH research team platform, which is the power market. And Jordan McNiven, who's leading the process for us, has a couple of quick hits that he wants to walk through.
All right, thanks, Matt. What I'm going to do here is share my screen with you. We're going to do a bit of a picture book tour through the global power markets before we pass it over to our power expert. So we'll start on wind here, and I think when you look at this first chart, it's really your kind of classic exponential growth chart. Really serious increases in power generation from wind. I think also interesting in here is the breakdown between your OECD and your non-OECD countries. In this case, they look very similar. We'll see some other ones, that don't necessarily look that way, and there are material divergences. And I think when we think about wind, we probably all think about Europe. They certainly were a leader here, but the rest of the world is really catching up here. From an outright basis, it's actually Asia Pacific that is the leader right now. I know the axes are probably hard to see there, but you have to just take my word for it. And meanwhile, that is a lot of that is just size. They are half of the global power market. But it is interesting to see that this isn't just a wealthy country or an OECD adoption. This is really a broader theme that we're seeing around the world. So that's a quick snapshot of wind there. When we flip over to solar, it's really a similar looking growth trajectory, albeit probably a few years delayed. Again, nearly an equal split between the OECD and the non-OECD. In terms of total scale, Asia Pacific now is just really way out in front of the pack versus the rest of the group. And so, again, just another renewable segment that is just really showing very, very rapid growth really across all regions of the world. Now we'll get into a bit more of the traditional energy. Here's a real quick look at where coal and where coal lies. Obviously the global warming villain here, but it is still the single largest piece of the global power stack. So, still very, very important. But this is one of those ones where, unlike solar and wind, is you have a real split between what's going on in the OECD and the non-OECD countries. And so you can see North America there in the blue chart in the second row there. We kind of know what's going on there. A lot of coal to gas switching. And so coal continues to lose share here. Europe looks similar, but not quite as extreme. But then on the flip side, you go down and you look at, say, Asia Pacific here, and it's just, a continual march higher as they continue to add more and more coal-fired generation. Here we have a look at gas. Gas is an interesting one as well. You look there, pretty solid growth amongst both OECD and non-OECD. And North America is really the story here. Coal-fired generation is dropping, as that last chart showed, but it's really getting picked up on the gas side. And so, in the OECD, coal fire has dropped 40% in the last 10 years, and this has almost been entirely picked up by gas. So, interesting dynamics there. And then, flipping over to this one, this is kind of just some charts to really kind of, put it all in perspective here. So the top left there, you have, kind of the total global power stack. You can see it's growing about 3% a year. And that gives you the breakdown of kind of what we're seeing. The coal and gas are on the bottom two there in the big pieces. The middle chart there, I think, is really an interesting one here as well. What this is showing is the blue on the bottom there is your OECD nations and their power demand growth, and the top is your non-OECD. So, really clear where the growth's coming from here, and it's clearly driven by the non-OECD nations, primarily India and China, and that's kind of what the double donut chart there on the right shows is just an increasingly larger piece of the market here being taken by the Asia Pacific nations. And so when you look at those last charts and you see what's going on kind of in the OECD countries in this, significant ramp up, say in gas fire generation, that's coming at the expense of something, because as you can see here, there's really no net growth occurring. And then you can see that even more clearly when you look at those bottom three charts. And so what you have here is each line represents the share of that fuel's piece of the total power stack. And so again, I know this is hard to see, and we'll make sure we send around the slides later for those who want them. But on the left is your whole world there, and so you can see coal just still running out way ahead of everything else. But a really strong uptick here on the gas side as well, and that's kind of a segue to the middle chart there, which is the OECD, and you can see that this is really what's driving the gas growth. And really, that's the shale revolution. So this is 1985 to 2019 is the whole chart. And you can really see where shale gets going there in the late 90s and then just keeps going. Now, when you look at the non-OECD countries, there's really actually not much action in this chart. Especially recently, you see coal really starting to flatten out. And then the rest of them are really quite static in terms of market share, even gas. And then if you kind of squint in the bottom right corner there, you can start to see the impact of renewables the last few years. Again, this is from 1985, so it covers a big period where renewables weren't really part of the picture. But you can start to see them, making an impact there in the bottom right. Again, now let's just kind of dig a bit deeper into some of the, kind of really meaningful drivers around the world. From the OECD nations, that's going to be the United States and Europe that are really driving things. The charts here that I really want to focus on are those ones in the middle. These are probably my favorite charts. And what you're seeing here is, the first line, which is basically nothing for the United States, is total power gen growth over the last 10 years. And so there's nothing going on. And we kind of already touched on that. However, we do see that big uptick in gas. And as mentioned, that's really coming at the expense of coal, which you see there falling off meaningfully. Flipping down to Europe, the axis I know is tough to see there. There's a little bit of growth. They're really small numbers in the global scale. But what is interesting here is you're seeing a really big uptake in wind over the last 10 years, and as well as solar. And coal is actually, again, the big loser there. Interestingly, gas is also down. Now, there are some interesting dynamics here where, gas is kind of ebbing and flowing. And more recently, with cheap LNG, Europe is bringing more gas into the mix, again, at the expense of coal. But interesting dynamics there. Again, flipping over to now our big growth markets, which, big ones the last 10 years, likely to be the big growth markets the next 10 years as well. So on the top, you have China. Again, in the middle, you see, in this case, huge growth. By far, the bulk of that is coming from coal, little bits of hydro and wind and such. Basically, a little bit of growth from everything, but really dominated by coal. On the bottom, we have India. And if China's in India, or if China's a coal story, India is definitely a coal story. Everything else here is more or less a rounding error. It's really just been coal that's been taking the lead in India. And then just to wrap it up here, I think the two on the left are just kind of interesting. The top left is global coal-fired generation. We know China is by far the leader there. And this chart really shows it. U.S. still number 3, despite the quite significant reductions that we've seen. The bottom one is maybe less, maybe the dominance there is lesser known, but it's the U.S. that just really trumping everybody else in terms of gas-fired generation. Second is Russia, but the U.S. just leaps and bounds ahead of everybody else. And then moving to the right side of the screen there, this is the whole world. So it's again these charts that show the net growth and then really where it's coming from. And so that first one, is 1999 to 2009. You can see coal and gas, the blue and green, they're really dominating the net adds. Everything else is fairly negligible. Then you move to the right, and that's the last decade we just finished up here, and really a much more balanced in terms of adds. Coal and gas still leading 1 and 2, but everything else is still in the conversation, and wind really starts to pick up here, and hydro and solar as well. And then, this is just a snapshot of 1 year, but then you go, down to the bottom row there and you have 2019. And so in 2019, still pretty solid growth in power gen. But coal now goes from kind of that leading position to the other side of the chart. Gas takes the lead role. And again, that is mostly driven by the US. But then, you look at where the ranking goes from there, and you've got wind, and then solar, and then have to point out nuclear for Colin because we know how much he likes nuclear. But what we're seeing here, I think what these 3 charts really encapsulate and really kind of sum up everything that we went through in really quick order here, is just how quickly things are changing. So solar and wind currently are still only 8% of the global power stack. But when you look at the rate of change and what's going on, they are a huge component of the rate of change. And so, we'll kind of leave it there and really, maybe you kick it over with the question mark there is, what do the next 10 years look like? And that's what our research team is working on right now, trying to figure out what that looks like and what that means not only for traditional coal and gas demand, but also for the renewables and really what it means for global power. So I'll leave it there. And thanks for allowing me to share. Okay.
Well, thanks, Jordan. I think where that takes us is now, Robert, that was a great place to end, Jordan, because Jordan ended on what does the next 10 years look like? And if you haven't done this, we at TPH really recommend you go out and watch Juice, How Electricity Explains the World, and also pick up a copy of A Question of Power. We've all read it. We've all watched the movie. We're all excited. And I think, Robert, this is the equivalent of a drum roll. But maybe just jump in. Robert, you've been
Sure.
at this for a long time. You've written, I think it's 5 books. You've studied all the issues, and I know our audience would love to hear from you, kind of how you got pulled into this debate, what gets you passionate about this debate, and what are the things you're watching closely when
Sure.
you think about the future.
Sure. Well, thanks, Maynard. I'm flattered to be invited, and those are interesting presentations. I'm going to mimic some of Jordan's comments here in just a minute because I have a few slides to show as well. But the first article I ever published when I was in high school, in fact, in Tulsa, was on the energy business. It was a anti-nuclear piece, and now I'm adamantly pro-nuclear, but too soon old, too late smart, as my dad used to say.
I saw that reference in your movie. I assumed you had an anti-nuclear girlfriend at the time. That must have been the problem.
Well, this was the 70s, and everyone was anti-nuclear back then. And I was fortunate to be raised in Tulsa. My dad wasn't in the energy business, but I was around it. And being around people who are working in the international, far beyond Oklahoma, and I realized quickly as I started writing professionally, this is the world's biggest and most important industry, and every other industry depends on it. So I've been lucky for the last 30 years to be writing about it, and just published my 6th book and made this documentary. And, I've just continued to be fascinated by it, and also kind of humbled by how little I feel like I really know about it, because it is such a big and complex business.
So the other thing I think that in the trailers, you talk about it in the movie, it's apparent, but sort of in the summary of how you made the movie, you talk about really traveling the planet. You went to a number of interesting energy examples: Iceland, Lebanon, Puerto Rico, New York City. I don't want to steal your thunder, but in each one you showed us a little bit of how we should think about energy in our world, and how different places have had different development paths based on energy. Would you mind hitting some of those and just the adventure you went on to
Sure.
to do the movie and to write your books?
Sure. Well, we went to India, Iceland, Lebanon, Puerto Rico, Colorado, New York. In fact, I just published a piece today on what's happening in Beirut and the electricity shortages there, and and about the generator mafia. And what in 4 years ago, when I started working on this project, I thought, well, I'll just write a book. And then I realized, well, we live in a video age, so how hard can it be to make a documentary? Well, it can be pretty challenging, honestly. And there was a lot of friction. But what the takeaway I had from all of the places we visited was that the electric systems in every country provide almost a perfect reflection of the societies that they power. So in Beirut, it's a very fractured, very sectarian, corrupt society. And so they have to depend on the generator mafia who run these small generators to have enough electricity. Iceland, a very small country, has enormous hydro and geothermal resources, so their grid is essentially all renewable. But that is because it's about place, that the electricity systems are very much determined by geography and local politics. So, and this is easily one of the world's most important businesses. The electricity sector is the world's fastest and most important fastest growing and most important industry. So I realized after doing several other books that I really wanted to focus on the electricity sector.
So Robert, this comment about the electricity, it reflects the society that it's in. Do you think that's because, you talk in your book and in the movie about the electric grid is one of the great inventions of the 20th century, but it required a lot of government involvement.
Sure.
And anything that requires government involvement is going to reflect the eccentricities of that government. And you talk a lot about what in the U.S. was done for rural areas as a result of the power policies of the FDR's administration.
Sure.
I guess what I'm getting to is that why your statement is true? And if that's true, are you worried? Because governments these days are not looking like productive, thoughtful organizations.
Well, I'll answer it this way, Maynard, is that what I realized, and I thought about this quite a lot, was so what are the imperatives to have cheap, abundant, reliable electricity? Well, it's integrity, capital, and fuel. and integrity is the single most important thing. And I'll run through some slides here in just a minute, but why did the New Deal electrification effort succeed? Well, it was because at that time in the 30s, the United States government and the local governments had integrity, that people believed in the system, that the system was legit. Well, you don't have that in Lebanon today. In the areas in Beirut that are controlled by Hezbollah, nobody there pays for their electricity. And the same thing we saw in India, where in some rural areas, 50% of the electricity is simply stolen. So the key factor, and I think it's one that is we're seeing now in some of the political realms, in some of the politically fashionable energy pushes, is that we need to have integrity in the political system and in what I call esprit de grid. People have to believe the system is legit, and they have to pay for what they use. And if they don't, then the system starts to erode and ultimately breaks down.
You know, Robert, in watching your movie, 2 points really jumped out at me. At one point, you have a guest who talks about the ends and the means kind of getting scattered and sort of losing sight of what the objective here is and kind of picking a side, you know, renewables or not. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And then a second question, there's also a very poignant moment where I believe you were in India and you were speaking with a woman who said, if you are absorbed in the darkness absorbs you. And it seemed like that really hit you as a revelatory kind of insight. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Sure. Well, let me take that last one, Colin, because that was an interview that I had with Joya Shri Roy, and I'm going to talk about her in just a moment when I'm just quickly run through some slides. Yes, Joya Shri was is an economics professor. She's now in Bangkok at the Asia Institute for Technology, but she's from India, from northeastern India, and she helped me and took me to Majlishpur, this tiny village in the outskirts of Kolkata. But she had that great line that, if you're in the darkness absorbs you too. And that you then cannot show the light to others. And I thought, well, that was almost like a biblical allusion, that if you're stuck in the dark absorbs you, and you can't bring light to other people. And if you look at the Bible or in any way religious, there's so many references that compare God to light, and it's in the Judaic, in the Jewish tradition, the Islamic tradition, this idea of God likeness as light. And it's a really interesting comparison to me. Your first question, I wasn't quite sure though. You lost me a little bit there, Colin.
I believe one of the folks in the movie said renewables is a strange basket because they're just sort of all piled together, and the basket becomes the thing, as opposed to what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to minimize land? Are you trying to minimize water use? Are you trying to be efficient? Are you trying to get emissions? Yeah. Like you kind of lose sight of what the purpose is.
Right. Yeah, that was a quote from Steve Brick. And he talked about that, renewables are the goal. And he said, no. Renewables aren't the goal. The goal is to provide cheap, abundant, reliable electricity to everyone. And so I think that comment is really relevant today because we see ideas like the Green New Deal and others are saying, well, we need to go all renewables. Well, why? I mean, what about the regressive effect of attempting that on the poor and the middle class? So I think that was a really critical point, that it's this idea, we need renewables just because they're renewable. Well, no, we can use them where they're appropriate, but to just be proclaiming, we just need renewables, no, it's absolutely wrong policy.
Robert, I know you've got some slides you're going to show us. I think one of the things you talk about in the movie and in your book is having being drawn to both natural gas and nuclear. Sure. Those two fuels stick out in your mind, and you couple them as being sort of the twin towers of what we ought to be building energy policy around. You want to flesh that out a little bit? Why you think that?
Sure. A few years ago, I was talking to a professor at MIT, and his name escapes me at the moment, but he was working on battery technology. He said, well, if you're working on anything, you need an acronym. And so I thought about it for a while. N to N, N to N, natural gas to nuclear. If we're serious about decarbonizing the electric grid or trying to even decarbonize other parts of the economy, what's the best no regrets strategy? And I think it's clearly natural gas to nuclear, that we want power sources that have and energy sources that have high power density, that is small footprints, and are low carbon, low cost, and scalable. And those fit in the natural gas and those are the apt descriptions of natural gas and nuclear. When now we're looking at the industry has adopted multi-well pads so that they're getting power densities that are equal to or exceeding those of nuclear power plants in terms of watts per square meter, which is the critical metric for analyzing what the footprint of any power source is. So, yes, I'm adamantly pro natural gas to nuclear. I've been talking about the same thing really for the last 3 books that I've written, that these are the 2 sources of energy that we can exploit more fully. So this is Rahenna Jamadar. I mentioned her earlier. And Joya Shri Roy, rather, I mentioned her earlier. She's on the right. Rahenna Jamadar is on the left. She lives in this tiny agricultural village called Majlishpur, which is located about an hour southeast of Kolkata. It's a small, predominantly Muslim agricultural village. And Rahenna, when I met her, she was 44 years old. She'd only had electricity for the previous 14 years. And we were standing outside her home, and she was telling us about how her life had changed because she had electricity and she was using electricity in her kitchen. But she was also talking about the fact that her children were using lights at night and were studying then at night. And we talked about a few other things about how much it cost and so on. And she also mentioned that one of her daughters was going to the university in Kolkata. And she said it with obvious pride. And I then asked her, I said, well, Rahenna, if you had had electricity when you were a child, would you have gone to the university as well? And she didn't even pause for a moment, and she nodded her head and to the side, as a lot of people in West Bengal do, and said, yes, I would have gone. And there was no remorse in it. There was no anger. It was just as though I'd asked her if the sun was going to come up in the east in the morning. And I thought about that for a long time. And then a couple days later, when I was in Jaipur, as I had some time to sit and think about it, I realized darkness kills human potential and electricity nourishes it. And her life was proof of that. Here was a woman who was very intelligent, obviously very, humble and not angry, but she had potential that she knew she hadn't realized. And that brought the human part of the story. I had lots of facts and data about India, and 800 kilowatt hours is about the average per capita consumption per year. But I realized, no, this is the human story. And electricity is about bringing people out of the dark and into the light. And why does this matter? It's because the disparity in electricity consumption globally is the single defining trait of our time. So if we care about climate change, we care about women's rights, we care about inequality, we have to care about electricity because this is key to all of those issues. And this is the just another couple of slides here, if I can get here we go. This is what I call the trifurcated donut. Similar a little bit to the slide Jordan showed just a little while ago, but on the right you have what I call the unplugged world. Those are the places in the world where consumption is less than 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. And then the high watt world, that's us. We use more than 4,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. And then the low watt world is kind of the median or the countries who are in the middle. But this is the other slide that I think helps bring this home, which is that in the unplugged world, 4 out of 10 people in the world today live in unplugged countries. 3.3 billion people today are living in places where electricity consumption is less than 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. Well, why does 1,000 kilowatt hours? That's the amount of electricity used by my old kitchen refrigerator. So the disparity here, and I knew I needed some metric by which to measure electricity and consumption. There 4 out of 10 people in the world use less electricity than an average American refrigerator. But the key to this slide is looking at the religious breakdown. 2/3 of the world's Muslims live in unplugged countries. And why does that matter? Well, this is Pew Research data. They estimate that by 2060, the global Islamic population will increase dramatically, and that by 2060, the share of global population between the Christians and the Muslims will be roughly the same. In that, I'm going back to this slide because if you see the Christians are pretty well evenly distributed among the high watt, low watt, and unplugged countries. But this slide obviously shows that if you look to the future, where is global population growth going to happen most rapidly? It's going to be in the Islamic countries. And if we care about this issue of what we see as some conflict between the Christian and Islamic world and where American military forces are deployed, they're largely in Islamic countries. And so this has potential consequences for a whole lot of issues that we care about, including military ones. But it's also critical for women and girls. This is a photo from the Library of Congress. I love their photo collection. It's free. You can go and look at it yourself. This is Nicholas County, Kentucky in 1916. Women washing clothes by hand. And why are they not washing clothes in Kentucky, rural Kentucky by hand today? It's because of what happened in the New Deal. This is the picture on my left is one of my favorites. That's obviously Lyndon Johnson kissing the head of Mr. Sam Rayburn, the longest serving Speaker of the House in U.S. history. That was on his birthday in 1957. Rayburn is on the left. Burton Wheeler is in the middle. He was a senator from Montana. George Norris was a senator from Nebraska. These three individuals were the key allies to Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the New Deal, and in particular in pushing for rural electrification. When FDR was elected in 1932, 9 out of 10 farms in America did not have electricity. And FDR campaigned, in fact, gave I write about it in my book, a speech in Portland about rural electrification. And he ran against Hoover and beat Hoover badly, one of the worst defeats of an incumbent in presidential politics in American history. But FDR, once he got into power, needed allies on Capitol Hill to help him push through rural electrification, and he got that help from Rayburn, Wheeler, and Norris. Johnson didn't get to Washington until after the votes happened. But these three men were involved. In 1935 was the passage of the Rayburn-Wheeler Act, also known as the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935. 1936 was the passage of the Norris-Rayburn Act, also known as the Rural Electrification Act. And what was the result? By 1950, just 18 years after FDR was elected, 9 out of 10 farms and ranches in rural America had electricity. And just 18 years earlier, 9 out of 10 farms and ranches did not have it. And in 1950, that situation was really flipped around. And that legacy of the New Deal is still evident today in America, where we have the most diffused ownership of any electric grid in the world. Roughly 900 electric co-ops operating in the United States, including the Pedernales Electric Co-op just outside of Austin. In 1937, FDR helped Lyndon Johnson get the first loan for the Pedernales Electric Co-op, which at that time did not have enough people to qualify for a loan, which is hard to believe if you've been in the Texas Hill Country lately. But why does this matter? Well, this electrification didn't happen all over the world. This is in Majlishpukur, the same village where I met Rehenna Jamadar, a woman pumping water. Electricity frees women and girls from the pump, the stove, and the wash tub. And that was one of the motivations that led Rayburn and Wheeler and Norris to push for electrification. Rayburn famously said, "I want my people out of the dark and I want my people out of the mud." And that push for rural electrification really changed American politics. It changed the face of rural America, and I think is still, we look at these cooperatives today, they are living remnants of the New Deal. And what's key for women today around the world, like this woman in Majlishpukur, is that in places where electricity is short or non-existent, women are effectively household slaves. And when you look at World Bank data, the countries with the highest rates of female illiteracy, the highest rates of child marriage, highest rates of genital mutilation are in countries where electricity is either scarce or non-existent. Okay, so
Robert, can I just ask you a question on that?
Sure.
Why does that issue around women in the developing world, why doesn't that seem to get more traction? Like, why aren't they more irate about that? Why isn't there more of a push to improve all that? Is it? It just doesn't seem like it catches on relative to the importance of it.
Well, that's a very good point. And I think that a lot of people just simply don't know about the importance of electricity to women. They've never experienced it here in America. But I think also, I mentioned the issue of integrity earlier, Maynard, and this is the hard part. It's that we can't send a box of kilowatt hours to India, right? If they're going to have a functioning grid, it has to be something that comes out of their own political and local system. We can't impose order and integrity on Lebanon. They have to make it happen there. And so the grid will shrink or not exist depending on that level of integrity in each society. So this is one of the great challenges of electrification, and lower cost fuel can be part of that, but it's not the only part. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So the question is, going back to the trifurcated donut, where will we get the juice for the 3 billion who are unplugged? Well, as we talked about earlier, I'm in favor of natural gas and nuclear end to end. But what about renewables? Well, in my view, there's just simply no way that renewable energy can meet the demands of the global energy sector at the scale that consumers demand and at prices that they can afford. This is data that I've collected myself over the last 6 years. We've had more than 270 local governments across the country, from New York to California, Vermont, Maine, rejecting wind energy projects. Why? Local people care about their local neighborhoods, and they don't want 600-foot high wind turbines in their backyards. And I can't say that I blame them. Jordan's presentation was good, and it's clear that wind energy has grown dramatically. But I also see some increasing friction, not just here in the U.S., but all over the world, and particularly in Europe. In Norway and Germany, the wind energy business has effectively been stopped in its tracks. This is an example right here. This is a photo from the Honolulu Star-Telegram from last November. That's a headline. I'm quoting it directly, that there were 200 people arrested. And now you won't read about this in the New York Times. It does not fit the popular narrative about wind energy and renewables being green and that they're being accepted all over the country. It's simply not true. The New York Times hasn't reported at all about the backlash against the wind energy business in New York, although it is very difficult to cite wind energy projects in New York. But 200 people arrested on the island of Oahu last fall, protesting against a wind energy project that was being built there. It was the largest act of civil disobedience against a renewable energy project, I think, in American history, and yet it was not reported in major media outlets. But this is an example of the resistance to the energy sprawl that comes with large scale renewables. And just a quick point on to follow on Jordan's point earlier, it's one reason why I think solar has more runway in front of it than wind, because the power density of solar is roughly 10 times that of wind energy. So you combine it with storage, and I think solar clearly is going to continue to grow. And we talk about that in the film and in the book as well. So where are we going? Again, echoing some of the slides that Jordan showed earlier, this is global primary energy consumption. I'm adamantly pro-nuclear. That's the yellow line there. But nuclear energy share of the global primary energy market has not grown in 30 years. Small modular reactors show a lot of promise. There are some very interesting companies that are trying to get licensing now. NuScale, Terrestrial Energy, Oklo. But even if they were to be able to get licensed today or tomorrow, for them to ramp up to the terawatt scale, which is what we're talking about in terms of need, 1,000 gigawatts at those kinds of increments, is going to take, I would say, a decade or two, or maybe even more. But meanwhile, that blue line is the natural gas trend line, and it is obviously growing apace and far faster than non-hydro renewables. This is the last slide here. Again, this is global generation from gas, wind, and solar. And you show, it clearly shows that the gas trend line is clearly up and growing faster than either solar or wind. So I'm very bullish on the gas market. Obviously the shale revolution has been the driver of a lot of that growth. And as Jordan's slide showed, a lot of that increase in generation is because of what's happened here in the U.S. But in the last few days, you've heard Shell talking about LNG to power in Vietnam. And I think it's clear that we're going to see more moves toward gas-fired generation all over the world because of demands for lower carbon generation and also cost. So quick commercials. 6 books. Wow. Look at all those books. I wrote them all. Look at that book on the right. That's the new one. I have 3 kids. Our youngest, Jacob, is in his senior year at St. Edward's University. I just wrote him a check so he can go to school on YouTube this fall, which was a little sobering, but nevertheless, help him out, help pay for his tuition, put it on your Kindle. I'll make a better royalty. I also have a new movie out. It's the best documentary you will ever see on electricity. I'm very proud of this film. My colleague Tyson Culver is the director. He did a great job. We have drone footage from the blackout in San Juan, Puerto Rico, maybe my favorite footage in the film. It's available on all your streaming platforms. And I have a new podcast, the Power Hungry Podcast. Subscribe on any of your favorite podcast outlets. If there's somebody that you think would be a good guest, by all means, email me, let me know. We had Matt Ridley on. We've had Michael Schellenberger. I have a new episode out today with Joel Kotkin, who has a great new book out called The Coming of Neo-Feudalism. I'll have Lisa Lanoz from Wind Action on next week. So that's the book, the film, the podcast. And this is one of my favorite photos. My wife, Lauren, took this photo when we were in Majlis Bukur. I love this image because these are the women that are living effectively in powerless lives. They're living in the low watt, or rather in the unplugged world. And this is one of the challenges, the biggest challenges of our time. How do we bring these 3 billion people out of the dark and into the light, and into modernity? Because the potential of these people is largely being wasted. Darkness kills human potential, and electricity nourishes it. And this is the challenge of our time, to bring these people into modernity with fuels that are affordable and as clean as possible. My last slide, I'm easy to find. I'm on the interweb, on the Google. You can find me pretty easily. So I'll stop that there and talk some more.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. If I can jump in quickly, I mean, very clearly you're a big supporter of gas. We are too. But would be curious your thoughts there and how it relates to hydrogen and the potential for hydrogen and the trade-offs here maybe between low cost and low carbon. And if you see that really being a long-term power solution, or if it just doesn't really fit in there.
You know, it's interesting to me, and I've followed this for a while, is just in the last few months, suddenly hydrogen is the thing. And, I'm sound like I'm joking. Well, we're already in a hydrogen economy. We just use it with a few carbons attached to it. And I just think that there is potential for hydrogen, but it's still, infinitesimally small. I think the total production in the U.S. last year was something on the order of 100 or 200 metric tons. I mean, it's a very, very small market. And I think that there are just physical problems with the management of hydrogen that are going to be difficult to overcome. Hydrogen embrittlement of metals, the seals for the tankage, those kinds of things. It has a lot to recommend it, but there are a lot of challenges. And I think that, yes, some of the gas infrastructure could be used to move hydrogen, but, I just think that there are a lot of challenges to overcome. And any of these transitions, when it involves energy and power, it's always about scale. Can it scale in a global market where we're consuming, 270 million barrels of oil equivalent per day? I mean, this is just a massive, massive business.
Robert, one question for you. You
Sure.
have talked a few times today, and you do it in your book and your film. You talk about energy density and how important it is. It's something that Michael Schellenberger talks a lot about. It's not something you hear about in the day-to-day energy debate. You hear costs, you hear emissions, but you don't hear energy density. Would you elaborate on that and maybe use our favorite nuclear plant, Indian Point,
Sure.
as an example? Because that's really a telling one.
Sure. So in my fourth book, Power Hungry, I call them the 4 imperatives: power density, energy density, cost, and scale. So power density I put first because this is the critical metric for describing the footprint of any operation that you have. So, of course, I'm not the only one that's written about this. Václav Smil has written some very good things on this. Jesse Ausubel, who's a tremendous scientist, and I count him as a friend of mine, has also done some great work on this. But why is nuclear so important? It's because the footprint is so small. Look at the Indian Point Energy Center in Buchanan, New York, which is now being shuttered. Wrongly, tragically, I would argue, for the city of New York. You have a power plant that produces at full capacity over 2,000 megawatts of electricity. It sits on 1 square kilometer of land. The power density at Indian Point is 2,000 watts per square meter. I mean, this is incredible power density. Meanwhile, the power density of wind, and I don't care where you put it, and I can cite you half a dozen sources, is 1 watt per square meter. The power density of solar, roughly 10 watts per square meter. The power density of the latest gas production facilities in multi-well pads is about 1,000 to 2,000 watts per square meter. People don't understand that what the method, or the amazing thing about what's happened in the oil and gas industry is by focusing more on economics, and the shale revolution has forced the companies to put their wells in closer proximity. It's been a marvel in terms of land sparing. So power density is absolutely critical. Energy density is slightly different, and that is that it's a measure of the density of the fuel in a given volume or a given weight. So that's why we use crude oil, because and oil is a wonder magical substance, because it packs so much energy, so many BTUs in a small space. And the difference, energy density is measured in BTUs, power density is measured in watts or in energy in joules. So two important terms, but they're continually confused, even in the energy business.
Well, and the stat that you talk about in the movie in particular is that Indian Point is providing 25% of New York City's power with 0 emissions on that very small footprint that you describe. And you also describe the massive footprint that would be required if you did that with solar, just to pick a flavor.
Sure.
But we're gonna shut it down.
Well, and the Unit 2 reactor was shut down in April, and I had a piece in the New York Post about it. I wrote an obituary for the reactor because it was prematurely disconnected, and I didn't think about it. You know, you're in a meeting or something, and you think about, you had some response that you could have thought of, and I could have put it in the film, but I didn't. But when we toured Unit 2, there's a spot in the turbine hall where there's a section of the turbine shaft that you can see, and it's spinning at 1,800 RPM, and it's a solid steel shaft about this big around. And I looked at it, and I realized later that one shaft was providing 12.5% of all the electricity in New York. 1 out of every 8 subway cars, 1 out of every light bulbs, 1 out of every 8 elevators in the entire city of New York was being powered by that one piece of spinning steel. And it was just this remarkable feat of engineering and architecture and ingenuity. And it's being shut down for political expedience because Governor Cuomo is trying to curry favor with the extreme left environmentalists. And what's happened, it's being replaced by natural gas-fired generation, which I'm pro-gas. But if you're serious about climate change, you're doing the exact wrong thing.
Robert, you touched on a point that is becoming extremely topical heading into the election. Joe Biden has chosen his VP for the runoff here. And just curious how you see the election and potentially the outcome of that potentially impacting energy policy going forward as we look over the next 4 years, if there is a change in leadership of the White House.
Well, I mean, that's the key question. I mean, what will Biden follow through on this energy plan that he put forward just a few days ago? And I did some quick calculations. He said that he was going to decarbonize the electricity sector by 2035. Well, I don't do complex math. I can just do these kind of very simple spreadsheets. But if you look at following on Jordan's presentation earlier, just the amount of electricity now being produced from coal and gas in the United States, about 2,700 terawatt hours per year. Okay, so they're going to back all of that out and do it in 14 years. Well, how much energy is 2,700 terawatt hours? It's roughly equal to all global nuclear energy production. It would be equal to, if memory serves, for the U.S. to produce that much energy from wind, we would have to have a 9-fold increase in wind energy capacity in the United States. It's simply not going to happen. But I think that, I would hope that if Biden is elected, there's some energy realism gets into his advisors and into his his colleagues. I think Obama realized that once he got into office, that trying to eliminate natural gas would be a bad move. So I hope that there's some moderating voices if Biden is elected.
Is Kamala Harris, are we going to see California's energy policies show up in the White House, or what would be your take there?
I don't know that Harris has done much on energy policy, but I did just do a paper, in fact, for a think tank here in Austin, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, on some of these policies that are being promulgated in California, and they're very worrisome. You've had over 30 municipalities in the and local governments in California ban or restrict the use of natural gas. Well, that's a regressive tax. And this is the part that I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm just a member of the disgusted party. But what the result,
You're welcome here, Robert. You're welcome.
We're among friends, we can talk.
Yeah.
But so this idea that you will prohibit the use of natural gas in new construction, force consumers to use electricity instead. Okay, well, this is part of the electrify everything push. I understand that's what they're claiming needs to be done for climate change. But if you're going to restrict or prevent the use of natural gas and force consumers to use electricity instead, you're forcing them to use a source of energy that is 4 times as expensive as gas on a BTU basis. So you're imposing a regressive energy tax. And I'm just enough of a liberal to think that's a bad idea. We cannot attempt to solve climate change on the backs of the poor and the middle class. And yet they've been completely ignored in a lot of these discussions about the Green New Deal and the rest of it. And at the same time, trying to force more renewable energy capacity into rural counties that are among the poorest in their individual states. So there are a lot of class issues that I think that need to be paid more attention to when it comes to these issues of climate and restrictions on fuels like gas that are clean, abundant, and cheap.
Well, picking up that last point, Brookline, Massachusetts was one of those towns that said it was going to ban the use of gas in new residential construction. And just in the past couple of weeks, the Attorney General of Massachusetts said no way, that there is no way a town is going to set the law of the Commonwealth. So you're beginning to see, even within some of these jurisdictions, some pushback from the state level government official as opposed to the town level official. One other point I would make is when we look at the 2020 data for the US generation mix in the United States, natural gas is a 39% share, nuclear is 21%, wind is 10%, and this is at utility scale facilities, solar is 2%. 2 is also, just rounding, the number for biomass. So while it's true the global share of mix is closer to 9%, and even in our long run models in TPH commodities, we have solar and wind going to 21% by 2030. I think people sometimes just lose sight of how large that natural gas fraction is. It grew at 8% year over year in the first 5 months of this year. It's true that wind and solar had double-digit increases from low bases. That's absolutely true. But one last anecdotal I would leave you with is pay attention to the price of uranium. It is surging. And the reason it is surging is because producers do not have enough supply to meet demand. They are in the spot market as buyers themselves to meet their physical commitments. And so when you are starting to see the long-dated natural gas market beginning to show signs of strength and the spot uranium market showing signs of strength, Robert, there are 2 market mechanisms that are supporting your point of view with real economics, real dollars in real time.
That's interesting. I'll just add one quick point on that, Colin, which is the bans on natural gas. And I'm glad you mentioned Brookline. There are a number of other cities that are considering similar bans. I think Tacoma Park, Maryland, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Seattle has entertained some in the possibility of this. But I think it was the end of July. I think it was July 31st. Southern California Gas, which is part of Sempra, filed a lawsuit against the California Energy Commission over these natural gas bans. So that, I think, is going to be the first substantive litigation. The California Restaurant Association has already sued, but SoCal Gas sued in Orange County Court, and that's going to be one of the first battles in court over this Electrify Everything effort. So it really is, I think, a very important lawsuit. I haven't written about it yet, but I'm planning to.
So, Robert, maybe as we wrap up, just a couple of thoughts. One is thank you for joining us, but two, on behalf of everybody who cares about a thoughtful and informed energy and environment and economy debate, thank you for everything you're doing. Here's the question: do you think, I know you're an optimistic person, so I'm leading the witness a little bit, but do you think this debate over the next 5 years is going to get better? And are we going to start talking about all of these issues, getting all of them on the table, solving for not just climate, but also development, also other environmental issues, costs? Is this debate going to get better in the next 5 years? And if you think so, tell us why.
I see things getting better. Like Molly Ivins was a pundit and an acquaintance of mine. She's been dead now, 10 years. She said, "I'm optimistic to the point of idiocy." Well, that kind of describes me as well. But yes, I do see a trend. You're saying there's a pony in here somewhere, maybe a few ponies. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. No, the world is getting better. We're reducing the numbers of people who are living in abject poverty. Electrification, we've doubled the amount of electricity available globally over the past 2.5 decades. We're going to need to double it again over the next 2 decades. That's a big challenge. But at the same time, I think that there's more of this energy realism is starting to creep into the debate. I think Michael Schellenberger's new book is part of that. Matt Ridley's book is part of that. I think there's a growing realization among the hardline climate activists that they can't be anti-nuclear. In my view, you're anti-nuclear, you're anti-carbon dioxide, you're pro-blackout. Well, I'm anti-blackout. But I think we're seeing some signs that they're going that tide is turning somewhat on the nuclear debate. And I think that the affordability issue, the humanitarian or humane part of the debate, I think is going to be emphasized more in the years ahead, because I think it has to be. And I think that if there's a necessity, it's going to happen. So I'm optimistic. And I think that even if the politics still stay stilted and not well informed, I think, to Colin's point, the market is going to show the way, and the market is already showing the way, and that's why we see so much uptake in the natural gas market.
Well, you're a warrior, and we all appreciate you, and it was great having you on. So thank you, Robert. Buy the book, watch the movie, and stay safe out there. Thanks, everybody.